Imagine you are a little girl. You have 2 loving parents and a dog. Your life seemed perfect. And one day, you're just walking home from school. As usual, you're laughing and playing and hopping with your friends. But the next moment, when you get to your house, imagine this is what you see. Your grandma is standing in your front yard, and she's beating your dog with a stick. And what's worse, she's cursing. She's cursing with the worst possible words that no child should hear. That little girl was me, and this happened about 30 years ago. I have no much memory after that, other than remembering that one of my neighbors put me out of the situation because she thought my grandma might hurt me. Many years later, I finally knew that my grandmother had schizophrenia. And I wouldn't say that's the main reason driving me to study the brain, but it might have affected my decision subconsciously. This is my story, and I'm sure each one of you has your own version of the story. It might not be the schizophrenia of your mother, of your grandma, but it could be the addiction or alcoholism of your dad. It could be the ADHD or autism of your child. Or it could be your own depression or anxiety. The truth is, mental disorders affect all of us. Every 1 out of 5 Americans has suffered from a mental illness-related condition in the past 12 months. That means if now I ask you to look to your left, look to your right, look to the back, and to the front, plus yourself, 1 out of 5 is affected or has been affected by a mental illness in the past 12 months. Mental illnesses also have a very high price tag. So the total cost related to mental illnesses are as high as $300 billion in a given year. And what does that mean? It's about half of our annual military spending and 10 times of the annual budget of the National Institute of Health, the main funding agency for biomedical research. Well, given the significance of mental disorders and the abundance of technologies and tools we have in our modern society, you might be thinking, of course, I'm sure scientists have figured out some way to solve this problem, right? Well, I wish I could give you a positive answer. But before I give you my answer, let's take a step back. Let's look at how our society has changed over the past 30 years. This is what a computer looked like back in the 80s. Well, some of us still remember that. We remember how bulky it was, how slow it was, the noise it made. And this is what a computer looked like today. It's as thin as a piece of paper, and it's yet still much faster than a computer from the 80s. Now let's look at how psychiatry has changed over the past 30 years. This is what doctors used to diagnose patients back in the 80s. It's called DSM-3. So DSM stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The key word here is that it's a manual, right? So when you go into a doctor's office in the 80s, There was no objective measure, no blood taken, no brain scans taken. You simply go in, you have a chat with the doctor. The doctor look at the symptom list and say, you meet 5 out of 6. Okay, you are diagnosed as depression or schizophrenia. And this is what we have today. Exactly the same system called DSM. Okay, now we have version 5 instead of 3. You got the point. Now let's look at treatment. Okay, maybe we just diagnose people in the same way, but maybe we have improved in our treatment. This is what my grandmother took back in the 80s. It's an antipsychotic. It acts on a specific dopamine receptor in your brain. It was somewhat effective. And this is what she's taking today. Exactly the same pill. Okay, so something seems seriously wrong here, right? Why is it that our technology, our society have moved on, but psychiatry hasn't? To further illustrate this problem, let me give you a few more examples. So now I want you to imagine that you think there's something wrong with your heart, and you go to see a cardiologist, and he wants to use a technique called EKG, electrocardiography, to measure the activity of your heart in order to give you a diagnosis. So my question for all of you is, would you use this doctor? Yeah. Sure, yes, great answer. No hesitation. Yes, because it is an objective measure of your heart, of the health condition of your heart. Yes. So now let me change up the scenario a little bit. What if I say your cardiologist only wants to sit down and have a chat with you? Would you use this doctor? No. Good answer. Good choice. No, no one should use this doctor. But what if I change the situation to depression? Would you use this psychiatrist? Yes. Well, some of you hesitated. Some brave ones gave a yes answer. But the truth is, there is no alternative option at this moment. So why do we have this double standard in medicine? Well, one of the fundamental reasons contributing to the lack of progress in psychiatry is because of the complexity of the brain. And it is fair to say that the human brain is the most complex organ in the entire universe. And this is what a human brain looks like. It has many different, functionally different regions. And the individual functioning unit is called a nerve cell or a neuron. Right? And a human brain has hundreds of billions of neurons. Imagine trying to map all of that out. But what makes things even worse is that the neurons also talk to each other. So they make these connections called synapses. And you can do the math with hundreds of billions of neurons. We will end up with trillions of synapses, connections in the brain. That is partially why it is so difficult to study the human brain. But in basic neuroscience research, we have actually developed really good tools to quantify the brain. And here I'm showing you an example. This is called an MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. And with this scanner, doctors can see if you might have a brain tumor or maybe some brain injury. But it turns out that we can use the same machine, the same scanner, to also look at activities of the brain. For example, if I present you with a face versus a house or a cat, your brain will show different patterns of responses, activations. And we can now look at these activations in real time. Okay, that's one very important development. And another development here is called brain-machine interface. So this really sounds like sci-fi, but it's not. Basically, we can put a device on you to record activities of your brain. And I can ask you to think, for example, if I want to move a coffee mug in front of me, I don't have to reach out my hand to do that. I can actually move the mug just by thinking about it. Well, the processes involved are much more complex than what I just described. But I can guarantee you that these are actually very sophisticated technologies now. And lastly, from the basic researcher's perspective, we have very sophisticated tools to actually map out the hundreds of billions of trillions of neurons and connections in the brain. We are getting closer to that goal. So it's not all just depressing news. We have made some really promising results and progress in basic neuroscience research. So on one hand, we have these amazing developments, quantitative tools in neuroscience work. On the other hand, we still have psychiatry sort of stayed in the Stone Age. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? It would be stupid not to give it a try, to try to marry these two, right? Why don't we use these quantitative tools to benefit psychiatry? This is a field that many colleagues and I have been working on in the past few years, and we call it computational psychiatry. And the goal is to use any quantitative objective measures to study mental health, to study mental dysfunction, and eventually with the hope that we can improve mental health. Let me give you two concrete examples of what computational psychiatry means. Well, first of all, we have done an experiment using an approach called a top-down approach, which simply means that we start with a hypothesis and we design experiments and collect some data to prove or disapprove this hypothesis. And with this approach, in combination with our quantitative tools, we can now tap into very complex and seemingly subjective or abstract mental processes, such as beliefs. In this experiment, we gave cigarettes to our smokers. And both in these two conditions, the cigarettes always contained nicotine in them. But we played with people's beliefs. In one condition, we told them that there is nicotine in the cigarette, and in the other condition, we told the smokers there's no nicotine in the cigarette. But in fact, there is always nicotine. And then we scanned people's brains. Here's what we found. First of all, when smokers had nicotine and believed there was nicotine in the cigarette, this part of the brain called ventral striatum lights up. And it's a part of the brain that is rich in dopamine and is involved in many important reward and learning functions. But when the smokers believed there was no nicotine, yet smoked a nicotinized cigarette, here's what we found. That's right. It looks like we're finally able to look into very abstract and high-level thought processes. And beliefs seem to be able to override the pharmacological effect of nicotine, a very powerful neuroactive chemical. And this is huge for psychiatry, right? Because distorted beliefs are present in almost all psychiatric conditions. And another example I want to show you has to do with the buzzword, machine learning. And from the previous cybersecurity talk, you probably already know that machine learning is used now everywhere in our everyday life, right? We know that AlphaGo, a artificial intelligence, can beat a human player very easily. And we also know that machine learning is how your tech companies understand who you are, what you're interested in, what you might purchase. So there's controversy around that, but the fact is machine learning techniques are very useful for neuropsychiatry research. And let me show you an example. In this study, the researchers used brain imaging in combination with machine learning to try to predict suicide. So some of us have lost a loved one to suicide. I have. And we all know that when people are thinking about suicides or are preparing to implement suicides, usually they will not tell you. Especially, they will not tell the doctor they're seeing, right? So we cannot use verbal report. And in this study, with the combined brain imaging and machine learning approach, researchers were able to predict with almost 90% accuracy of either suicidal thoughts, so just thinking about suicide, or even suicidal attempts, so the attempts of trying to commit suicide. So think about how many lives we could have saved. But think about how many lives we might be able to save in the future. Well, it's like planting trees. The second best time is now, is today. Why should all of you care about psychiatry, computational psychiatry, even if you haven't lost a loved one to self-harm behaviors? Well, there are at least two reasons I can think of. The first one is that mental health care will eventually become much more personalized. So I gave you the example of my grandmother, and this is the drug that she has been taking for the past 30 years. But perhaps your body responds differently, your brain responds differently to this, and you actually need triple the dosage. Maybe you need a completely different medication. Right now, in our current standard practice, this is not possible. We cannot know which patient is going to respond better to which medication or at what dose before they start the treatment. Or perhaps you actually need talk therapy, because we know that talk therapy still works. And the second reason is that mental health costs will eventually go down, and more people will have access to mental health care. So we know many people in our society are uninsured. Even if you're lucky that you have insurance, your insurance might not fully cover the expenses of mental health-related services. And even with that, just thinking about the trouble of having to stay on the phone line for 30 minutes to get a confirmed appointment, and then drive through town, fight through traffic for half an hour, and then you still end up spending $200 per visit. So here is a related field called digital mental health. So imagine now you can do that at home. You can monitor your own mental health with these apps, with these digital platforms. The important part here is that these measurements have to be implicit and objective. Also, think about the fact that you might be able to talk to a professional over the phone or online. And you can do that every day, every week, instead of once a month or once every 6 months. And lastly, there are even online forms of support groups. So this is similar to AA, but it's done completely online. And all of these digital mental health platforms already exist. And we just need more people to be aware of them. And more research needs to be done to prove their actual efficacy. So everything I have told you so far is no longer science fiction. We are making very good progress as a scientific community. But in order for this to happen for everyone, for every one of you to benefit from these technological developments, scientists cannot do this by ourselves. We'll need support, we'll need funding from the government, funding from private foundations, or even private donations. That's one. And number two, we need more talent. We need more fresh minds to join us in this endeavor. And lastly, we need support from all of you. And this is what PLUS means for me. Thank you.